Hey guys, Justin here, So Motorsports, and boy, January for 2023 has just flown by. So one of the things we're going to really be trying to do, here in the year 2023 and beyond, is try to have a very involved and good long form tech talk at least once a month. So today, just for documentation purposes, today is Wednesday, January 25th, 2023. And we're going to discuss something today that happens all too often in the VQ community, which is engine failure. Well, this is a unique engine failure because this is one of our Stage 2 HP packages. So today we're going to be going point by point in depth into why this failure happened and how you can prevent it. So we're going to pretty much go through the process and everything of what we actually found. So the first thing that we found was when the heads were pulled, you can actually start to see scorch marks on the head gasket, mainly on the underside where the hoop actually goes into the receiver. There were 3 cylinders that were very prevalent on this: cylinder 6, cylinder 5, cylinder 2, and we also observed coolant in cylinder 4. So you get you a close gander right here at this head gasket, you can start to actually see burn marks. Right there, and right there. Well, where this corresponds on this block, so it will sit this direction. So if you look, you can see there are no scorch marks on top of the head gasket. Generally, when you have a head gasket failure, you see scorch marks on both sides. That would be, head gasket compressed too far. Something started to come up that wasn't supposed to. But once you flip it over, you can see those scorch marks match exactly on the cylinder. Cylinder 2 being one of the worst, which we'll show you the bearings in a few minutes so you can actually see what was going on inside the cylinder, explain that a little bit further. So what caused this, and one of the things we'll be discussing today, is something called EMAP, which is exhaust manifold absolute pressure. This term is used to describe the actual amount of pressure that is inside your hot side at any given time. So that is the manifold, crossover, all the way up to the turbocharger. EMAP is everything from the turbine housing all the way to the cylinder head. So generally on an engine, you'll want to see about a 1-to-1 ratio whenever something is happy. Once you start getting an excessive EMAP pressure, 2 things happens. Number 1, exhaust can flow back into the cylinder. The reason this happens is because the EMAP is higher than the boost pressure inside the intake manifold. So, simple math, pressure will push back into the cylinder. And number 2, once you actually get past the point that the exhaust valve spring can hold the valve shut, it will hang the valve open and allow exhaust gas to get back into the cylinder. So one of the ways we alleviate this, and for a lot of you folks that have our turbo kits on your VHR or even our HR, this manifold is one of the HR manifolds, early VHR manifold, and it's good to 700 horsepower is usually what we push them to. Anything beyond that, you want to have something a lot more free flowing. Well, whenever we do our 1,000 horsepower manifolds or 1180 like David's car does, this is the size primary you want to have. If you look right here, you can see it's a pretty substantial difference on the primary size. The reason being for this, you have to have the volume inside the exhaust system in order to allow the exhaust gases out fast enough so that way you don't hang valves open, have exhaust gases going back in the cylinder, so on and so forth. So, what does EMAP cause? EMAP causes extreme cylinder pressure. Cylinder pressure at the right time is a good thing. Cylinder pressure, especially excessive cylinder pressure at the wrong time, is a really bad thing. So what does that mean? That means pistons coming up, you got a flame front coming down, they meet at the wrong time. That creates pressure. That actual meeting of it's a rock and a hard place. Neither of them want to give up. So if you look right here, here is the rod 6. You have cap and you have the rod side. This is the cap side. This is the rod side. So what you're looking at is you see there is a substantial amount of damage on the rod side, but virtually no wear on the cap side. Now inside the engine, put these 2 shells together, caps on the bottom. So when you have an excess of cylinder pressure, it is going to shove that rod bearing into the crankshaft and through the oil film. You know, I'm sure you can imagine once you start having metal on metal, bad stuff happens. And that's really what you're seeing right here is the top layer of the bearing wiped off. These are triple coated. I believe we have another coating that adds on to them as part of our proprietary package. But as you can see, there is a substantial amount in one particular spot of this bearing that is gone. So this is number 6. One of the other problem children in this engine was cylinder 2. Cylinder 2, you see the same thing. This is the cap side, virtually no wear. This is the rod side, entire top layer, top 2 layers or so of the bearing, completely wiped off. Again, that's from the excess of cylinder pressure pushing the piston and the rod down into the crankshaft and pushing the bearing through the oil film. And the oil films are raised. The actual clearances for bearing for oil is raised. We also run a higher weight oil to take some to cushion that impact a little bit. Because the impact is going to happen, but as long as you cushion it properly, there'll never be bearing to crank contact. Now, why does the damage happen to the bearing? Well, if you had something like this little plastic rod right here, or even a stock rod per se, it would not push the bearing into the crank. It would snap the rod, or it would S the rod. That's where you see rods get bent. Unfortunately, being that this engine has our Soho pistons and rods into it, very solid components, they don't bend, they don't flex, they don't break. At least we haven't found a failure point for them yet. So it shoves the bearing into the crankshaft. At that point, you start to get scoring. So, you know, basically think again about the rock and the hard place analogy. So you have all this flame front coming down from the top, and you have a bearing that is inside the crankshaft, so you have a mechanical lock at that point. Pressure's got to go somewhere. It is going to exit somewhere. Being that the sleeves in this engine are very resilient, our head stud package is very resilient, it's going to exit somewhere, so the place that this engine found to get the pressure out was under the hoop. Now, a lot of people are going to start to say, oh, well, it lifted the head. We understand that's a concern in the VQ, but until this engine, we have never seen an instance of head lift in this fashion. And I say that because this engine did not crest 900 horsepower, but we have engines doing 1200 horsepower that have never had a failure in this fashion. We have one engine that's doing 1060, we have one engine that's doing 1100, we have one engine that's doing 1179. None of them have suffered a failure in this fashion. So, as a little bit more of the, so we discussed cylinder 6 and discussed cylinder 2. So now we're going to get into cylinder 5, because a lot of really bad stuff happened in cylinder 5. And the way you can tell is you can see the scorch mark here. See the scorch mark at the bottom? That is actually opposite to the other side. So the other side, all the scorch marks were at the top. This one was at the bottom. If you look at the cylinders, here's cylinder 2, 4 and 6 pistons. The burn on them's, pretty similar. But once you look at cylinder 5's, it got hot. And when I say it got hot, I mean it got hot enough to start pitting a billet aluminum piston, which is substantial, to put it in a word. You can also see evidence of this in the cylinder head, where if you look over here into the cylinder head, you can see the burn on these is fairly clean. Exhaust valves are a little bit lighter, a little bit wider than we want to see. But you get over here to cylinder 5 is dry. There's, like I said, something, the bad stuff really happened in cylinder 2. That was, or not cylinder 2, but cylinder 5. I apologize. And that's really where a lot of the issues came to in this engine, because, an engine's like a chain. The weakest link is going to give up. So this is the one that actually gave up. We believe that a lot of the exhaust manifold pressure entered back into cylinder 5, and that's why you actually see that this cylinder is dry. So if you walk back over the block, get my light out here so you can see it a little better. If you look, there is a lot of vertical scoring inside the cylinder. So that's 2, that's cylinder 4, that's cylinder 6. So that's washout. That's effectively that when you use a non-oxygenated fuel like ethanol, you'll start to actually have it wash the cylinder down. There's not enough oil to keep the rings lubricated. So we've discussed a good bit about the rod bearings and the specific damage on cylinder 6 and on cylinder 2, and then also on cylinder 5. So we wanted to show you a couple different types of failures, so that way it'll further explain, how we came to the conclusion with this engine of the failure happened, when it did, and why it did. So if you look at these bearings, these two bearings looked exactly the same. Same engine package, different engines. One's shiny, so this was a lack of lubrication issue. The oil actually lost viscosity in this engine. This one, this bearing shell looks brand new. The way you can tell that is because right here, I have a pack of unopened bearings, and right there is a brand new bearing. You can see the coating, you can see that the finish on it's uniform, just like this bearing. So to reiterate, this is the cap side, which is the underside, this is the rod side, and then you can look over here and roll it over and see there is about a 3/4 inch to say 1 inch chunk where there is a layer of the bearing missing, the coating, top layer of the metal. So we'll set these back into place here and then go a little bit more into the main bearing portion of it. So this is a brand new one. I'm gonna throw this back in the pack. So obviously you have that amount of pressure hitting piston and rod at the wrong time with enough force that it pushes the rod bearing through the oil film into the crankshaft. So what happens with the crankshaft when that happens? So if you can imagine, here's the crankshaft out of that engine. So you've got cylinder 6 taking hits, cylinder 2 taking hits, also cylinder 5. So what's going to happen is, as this crank's taking hits, it's going to rock and bang back and forth inside the main bearings. And the way we can tell that is by walking right back over here and flipping these main bearings over and seeing the amount of damage that is on them. So you can see that one's got a little bit of scoring. On the girdle side, it's really bad. So that's number 1, which is the furthest away from the most damaged cylinders. This is number 4. So this is the girdle side, which is the bottom. Again, that's the one that's actually catching the crankshaft whenever the rod pushes the crankshaft down with that amount of force. So this was catching all that force, that number 6 and number 5. It was pushing the crank into this bearing. This is the girdle side again. And you can actually see through the entire main bearings, this is number 3. Number 3 girdle side, it's wiped also. See, a lot of the bearing material is damaged. And then the actual block side is clean. Now again, the reason for that is because the girdle side is what's actually underneath. So it's punching the crankshaft, and it's actually shoving the crank down into the girdle in the same way that the rod was the one that was actually taking the brunt of the hits. So that's why you'll see one side of the bearing wiped, the other side of the bearing in much better shape. Something else that was discussed upon tearing on this engine is that the client informed us that there were spark plugs that were broken discovered on the dyno, according to dyno pool. So this is standard Denso used plug out of a stock engine. I did break the porcelain on this one just to show what broken porcelain looks like, so you know exactly what we're talking about. We're not talking about this part, we're talking about this part right here. This is the porcelain that's designed to take heat. It's also not conductive whatsoever, so whenever the coil shoots voltage into here, jumps the electrode, grounds in the head. So this is designed to take heat and to keep effectively voltage from getting out of the electrode into the side of the head. A lot of people have questions, how do you break one of those? Well, there's 1 of 2 ways they break. First way is by dropping it. It's actually really difficult to break porcelain on a spark plug by dropping it. No damage. I am not being easy with this, and breaking this porcelain is tough. So imagine the amount of violent vibration that had to actually go into the cylinder head in order to shatter the porcelain on what was reported as 3 spark plugs had actually broken porcelain on them. And some people may say, okay, could have dropped them. Sure, we discussed that possibility. Really think it'd be coincidental that 3 of the plugs were dropped, especially being the plugs are $60, $70 a piece. That's the kind of spark plugs you tend to be careful with. And those spark plugs also would have been installed by Soho. And we ran this engine on a run stand. no running issues whatsoever. When you start having shattered porcelain like that, you'll actually start to feel, you'll see misfires in an engine even at idle, because the arc will jump from the plug to the cylinder head where it's not supposed to, instead of from the electrode and nodule. So the other possibility that was discussed was over torquing. So I can tell you for a fact from experience that you can take this spark plug, put it into a head, put a 1/2 inch impact on it, run it down. You will strip every single thread inside the cylinder head before you break this porcelain trying to over torque a plug. It's just not how these work. This is all steel body. When you tighten this is all one piece. All the torque goes into the threads. It'll wipe the threads. It will not damage this. There is no side, no lateral, no load on the porcelain whatsoever that will cause it to shatter. There were two main factors that caused the breach. It was not a failure of machining, as you can see by the bearings and how half the shell was good, half the shell was bad. It was not a failure of the head gasket system, due to the way the head gasket system is set up. We know that for a fact because, again, we have engines doing 1,000 to 1,200 horsepower on this exact head gasket setup with no failures. And it was a result of two things. The volume inside the header was too small, which that's where you get EMAP from. And then it was also a result of pressure being exerted in the cylinder at the wrong time, which can also be, it can be called two different things. It can be called pre-ignition and be called detonation. So pre-ignition is stuff starts to melt. That's basically the octane of fuel is too low and it ignites. The mixture actually ignites before the spark plug ignites it. So this is not what happened in this case. What happened in this case is it was ignited when it was commanded, which was too soon in the calibration. Flame front met the piston, and it caused some really bad stuff to happen inside this engine. We have had engines suffer from head lift here during the development of the HP package. Everybody knows head lift's a big thing in the VQ community. One of the big things that we can, deduce from this is the fact that it was not actually head lift due to a stud issue or a gasket sealing issue, is the fact that all the bearings are damaged. We've seen probably 10 to 15 engines come apart from clients, or even ones that we had put together prior to the HP engine package we're doing now, and there was no bearing damage whatsoever. It was effectively remachine the block, reassemble everything, everything's good to go. No crank damage, no bearing damage, no whatsoever. So effectively what you're seeing here, and what actually ultimately caused the failure of this engine, was pressure in the wrong place at the wrong time, especially there being too much. So there was one part of it where EMAP was going back in the cylinder and superheating everything, which once you superheat components, when they cool down, everything contracts. Well, if you heat it up too much, you get metal fatigue. Everything contracts. That's when you get coolant into a cylinder where you don't want it. Head lift also happens in boost. It doesn't happen out of boost. Anytime that anybody's ever seen head lifts in this community, it was always on, their high boost pulls or anything like that. So the way this engine actually had an issue was the engine was run, everything cooled down. At that point, coolant was observed leaving the exhaust after everything cooled back down. So if it was a head lift issue, it would have been noticed on the dyno, high boost, which is obviously not the case, or not the case in this scenario. So in conclusion, this particular HB, we want the best for our clients. We put the best things possible together that we can. This one was not a result of Soho Motorsports machining, Soho Motorsports products, Soho Motorsports assembly. It was a result of outside forces that were outside of our control. And it's one of the main reasons that, we take a lot of pride in being able to get client vehicles here and looking everything over and making sure everything's up to snuff. We don't have any issues with it. We don't think there's going to be a velocity issue. Don't think there's going to be a volume issue. We don't think there's going to be a fuel issue. And there's another reason, we really try to make sure that all the cars that try to make this amount of horsepower has all these proper components, because we have the formula. We have multiple vehicles that are making well over 4 digits. So in conclusion for this whole setup, there are 3 really simple ingredients to making a VQ live. Number 1 is proper fueling, 2, proper equipment and assembly, and number 3, proper calibration, which is really important. Knowing the restrictions, knowing the limitations of your turbo system, and having somebody who can account for that and basically know when to stop. So, and the reason we know that for a fact is because David's car made 1,179 horsepower, and it's out of turbocharger. So had we kept ramping the boost up, it would have suffered a very similar fate, because it doesn't matter how good your components are, if the calibration's off, you can blow up a stock engine, especially one that's trying to push this much power through small manifolds. So, you know, that's it for today. Thanks for watching this tech talk. We hope this clears up any confusion with what kind of, you know, engine failures happen and when. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. You know, yeah, there's a lot that goes into making these things make power, and everything has to work in harmony. You know, the engine, the tune, the fuel system, the turbo system, everything is a symphony. And if something is not doing what it's supposed to do, you get a failure.